This is a production of Cornell University.
We work a lot with mortality. We work a lot with composting, with organic matter at the Waste Management Institute. And in this last year, how many people knew that we had an avian influenza outbreak in the United States? So quite a few people. If you listen to NPR, they did have it on NPR. They had it on some other places. It was in some publications. But it wasn't out there that vastly. 50 million birds were affected west of the Mississippi. So we didn't get it in the east at all, so we didn't have to deal with it in the east, but we were commissioned to deal with it in the west, so, or from west of the Mississippi. So we did lose 50 million birds, or 50 million birds had to be either killed or they died of the disease. They don't die of the disease right away. Some, when we came onto site, would be dead, but there would be some half dead, and there'd be some alive, and there'd be, you know, all different ones. So it was interesting. Were we ready? We work with, for the last 13, 14 years, we've been working with APHIS, so Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, and we work with them in Washington, D.C. So we're working with them, and we work with them on mortality issues, because when we have a disease outbreak, we need to be dealing with that disease, and we're going to have a lot of carcasses to get rid of. We don't have a lot of options to get rid of these carcasses, so they oftentimes lay around, and when there's a disease outbreak, they can't lay around. So this year, last year, was the first time push came to shove. Actually, it was January last year, push came to shove, and they said, we need to get these birds dealt with, and we need to get them we need to compost them. A lot of the poultry farms felt that they were going to be able to just landfill them, and the landfills would take them, or they'd be able to bury them. And in most cases, that was not the case. Some things did go to landfill, and we'll talk about those, but for the most part, the landfills don't want them, because the people that work in the landfills, there's fear that they may be exposed to the diseases. It's not a disease that has jumped to humans at this point, but it's still a disease that's airborne and can move around, and the fear is there. So the landfills won't take them, and they're all private landfills, so they don't have to take them. Nobody can say you have to take them. So they're there. One very, very large farm with millions of birds, I think it was a Genio farm, right? The Genio farm in Iowa?
No, that's Center Fresh.
Which was it?
Center Fresh.
Center Fresh.
Not Center Fresh. Yeah, it's not Genio. But
not
yeah.
Purdue, but one of the big ones that we'd recognize the name. They just got those big mobile, the foldable dumpsters that they say, just put all your stuff in and we'll take it away. You know, so they got those and thought that they were going to get rid of them that way, and weren't able to. So we come onto the farms. I got a call. I was the first one out in the United States, so I got a call from APHIS on a Saturday night saying, can you go to California? And I happened to be in Utah writing, Mary and I were writing curriculum in Utah. And I said, well, I guess so. So the next week, I went out to flew to Modesto, went into California, and met with the first farm. So I talked to the farms quite a bit before I went in, because you have farm managers and you have farm owners, and the farm owners are very hands-on. They're the ones that are financing these things, so they don't know very much about what's going on, but they want to have control. So we went out, we provided them with educational materials beforehand so that they had an idea of what we were going to do. And one of the things that we need for these to compost is carbon. We have to have carbon on the farms. We can't just pile up birds and expect them to degrade. And in this situation, we really needed to sanitize. And that's what we're there to do, not to make compost. We're there to sanitize and kill the virus in the birds. So we provided them with information so that they knew what was going on. We tried to get carbon to the sites before we got there, because all we're doing, we're not actually, yes, we were physically moving birds and things like that, but we're not there to, we're there to direct operations, to let them know how to do it and then to make sure that it's working properly once they do that. Speaking with the managers, they've had a huge loss. You know, if you can imagine losing millions of birds on one farm, they're affected mentally, emotionally. We have to think about that as well. And so that was one thing that we had to go on the farm and say, okay, we understand where you are. We understand that it's really important to you, and we need to deal with this whole situation. Before we could go in, we needed to have full PPE. So there are disconnects on who wears what, actually. So this is what I was wearing. You know, this is the type of stuff that I was wearing. I had full PPE. I had, you know, I didn't have glasses at first, but I had everything else, breathing apparatus, all that kind of stuff. The farm, this is the farmer up here, had a medical gown on. So that's what the health department provided them with. So they said, can we get some PPE, some protection for ourselves? And that's what they ended up with. So there's a real difference there. This is provided by APHIS. When we get there, it's, you know, we're getting dressed and taping everything, doing all that kind of stuff. And the farm themselves, the farmers themselves, don't have access to that until they get there. So the health department kind of gave them a raw deal in this case. This is actually was in South Dakota. And I'm going to turn it over to Mary. Let me just stand here so I can pick you up.
Okay, well, I think you can pick me up without first standing right here. Okay.
Cool.
So Tim was talking about the importance of assessment and knowing what you're walking into. And when I got to Wisconsin in April of 2015, this is what I walked into. Not at all what I was expecting. I had received some information from APHIS about the size of the houses and how many birds, and I'm thinking to myself, we've been doing a lot, we had done a lot of birds before, you know, I knew how to compost, and I'm thinking, okay, no big deal, we'll take the litter, you know, we'll spread it out on the ground, we'll throw the birds on top, we'll throw some carbon on it, we're all good. Yeah, not at all. So we get there, and this is on a farm that has a it's called cage-free layers, okay? There are 3 of these alleyways in each house, okay? They're cage-free because they're free to fly around, all right? This thing is 370 feet long. These alleyways are 3 feet wide, okay? There's only a door here.
One door.
One door. One door. And in front, there's a small, like 6 by 10 space that you could maybe wheel something in, okay? I'm thinking to myself, how on earth are we getting all these dead birds out of there? Now this guy's got 5 houses, okay, with 3 of these in each of those houses. All are 370 feet long with 1 door. In this particular house, this is the first house, there was 44,000 birds. They were all dead when I got there, okay? I got there on a Monday.
Except for the ones up on top.
No, I think actually that one's still dead. He just hung out there, okay? I got there on a Monday. I think they had died on Thursday. Okay? Now, and this is from the disease. Okay? Now, luckily, they kept it cool in there. So, they weren't totally liquefying. I mean, they were starting to liquefy. But they didn't smell terrible. There was still some stuff there. Okay, it wasn't just a liquid mass. The second barn, the second house had about 80% dead with 28,000 birds. The other 3 houses that had about, I don't know, 35,000 each, there might have been 10% dead. So it hadn't spread, okay? It probably wasn't going to because we're talking 4 days in between. So it probably wasn't gonna spread any further. So now we gotta kill those other 3 houses. Plus we gotta kill the 20% in house 2 that haven't been, didn't die of the disease. And on top of it, you can't foam in here, because you got birds flying up here, okay? And if you foam, and Jean will show you some foaming later, if you foam, you're only getting here, unless you can fill that whole house up, and then you're in real trouble because everything's soaking wet, you ruined your equipment, and your birds are just, boneless or something, right? They have boneless chicken.
That's how it happens.
Yeah. So this is my nightmare, okay? And this is my first time dealing with an emergency situation. Luckily I had the people that I got in contact with as soon as I got there were well prepared. They fit tested me, they gave me a person who knew her crap, knew her chickens, knew something. She was very smart. And we got all the PPE and everything like that. So everything was good. This is the front of that barn, and this is all of the equipment. Okay, so, we're trying to figure out how to get the birds out. We're trying to figure out where we're going to compost, because we can't compost in the barn because there's no space for it. Okay, they're talking about sending the workers down like they would to collect eggs in their dust mask, not even a respirator, in their dust mask, and walking down through the 370 feet, to pull dead chickens. They're gonna have to push a cart clear away, pull them back out, and I'm like, no, that is definitely not happening, and that's a health hazard. That's just not happening. We'll figure something else out. So, this is what we figured out, okay? And actually, so I should tell you that I was there from a Monday through a Friday. Okay, we still had not started composting at that point. We did build a test pile, which I'll show you so that I could teach them how to compost. But now we're talking, those birds have been dead a week. The other birds still haven't been killed. The ones that are dying are liquefying, are getting bad. But so as they're waiting, this is what, and I apologize for the fact that it's sideways, but it was taken sideways on an iPhone, so. Oh, okay, hang on, let me go back.
Just click.
There we go. So this was that manure belt, and they pushed the birds down onto the belt, and they came down into the manure system, and then came out here, because they had a manure system that went from each barn to the compost. This is a compost barn where he was composting manure. And that's where we ended up building our first few piles, okay? So using ingenuity and whatever they had on hand until they did finally contract with a company to come in and suck the dead birds out with a big vacuum, okay, to get the dead birds. But then they had more trouble with depopulation, and they ended up having to suck out portions at a time and then use a garbage can CO2 killer, which I was not part of, did not see. I'm glad I didn't. I heard it was a fiasco, but that's, you make do with what you have. So, I should probably have had the other one first, because this is a layer. When we compost birds, smaller especially birds, we can't do it the way Jean's going to show you with the turkeys. We need to have a bed of carbon, okay, and then you put the dead birds, layer the dead birds and their manure on top of it, and then you cover with more carbon, and then you build in layers. And we have back there some fact sheets,
Yep.
so you can actually see the process. This was the first windrow that, and actually, is there a pointer? I don't know. Anyway, right here on this little corner, you can see something that's raised up. That was the test windrow, which is in the next slide, that Becky and I built before I left to show her how to do it. And then they continued on with the base and built more windrows, and they ended up with 3 inside. But there were so many birds that we ended up with maybe 12 more outside. And we had to get, they had to get permission from the Department of Natural Resources as to where they could put those piles, so that took some time. You know, a lot of rigmarole. You have to have the maps to see where there might be hydrologically sensitive soil or whatever, so that you could get approval to put these windrows outside. So there was a lot of stuff that we had to go through. And in addition, this farm had 200,000 dozen eggs that also needed to be taken care of. They were all in cold storage. Eggs, as you all know, are round and they roll, right? So if we tried to put all of those eggs into these compost piles whole, they would roll out. Plus, they're cold, and they're cold. You don't want to put a whole bunch of cold stuff, which Gina will talk about later too, in your compost pile, because we're trying to create heat, because heat is what kills the virus. So, and the other problem with them was they were in flats that hold 2.5 dozen. Some of them were cardboard, which is fine, we could compost that, but some of them were plastic. So to compost those eggs, which a lot of farms did end up composting their eggs, we chose not to. We were able to take all of those eggs, you know, on a fork, on forks, put them into a big truck, deliver them to the landfill. Okay, that was a lot easier. But to do, if we were going to compost them, we would have had to dump them all out of their containers, break them somehow, and then add them to the windrow as we were building. So that was just not something that was going to happen. We did add feed. They had just gotten new feed for the birds just before this hit. And of course, very little of it was eaten because the birds were dying. So we had to empty out all their big feed the big feed silos and put that into the pile. And you have to remember that all of the things that could possibly be contaminated when you take care of these things. So this is the teaching pile, okay? And this shows just separate layers of it. What we did, because I really wanted them to do this right, was we built a 2-foot base, which is what we recommend, what CWMI recommends. Some people would use less, but I know my 2 feet is probably different than your 2 feet. So what we did was we built a 2-foot base, and then we put sticks in to leave 2-foot clearance all around, and made them put the birds in that clearance. And then we moved the sticks up and made the sticks were like 2 feet, and we made them fill that. Well, they were. Then you have a 1-foot layer in between, and we made them filled up with the carbon to 1 foot. I don't know if they did that throughout all of the compost piles, but I wanted to make sure that at least the teaching pile was done properly, so that they would get adequate temperatures and get adequate microbiological, or the microbes would do their work. Now these birds, remember, these birds were a week old, well, not quite a week old, about 5 days dead, 6 days dead when we built this pile, okay? And within 3 days, so they were cold, you know, they weren't hot anymore. Within 3 days we had temperatures of 130 because we did build this right, okay? And that had a lot to do with the amount of base and the clearance and the addition of the carbon. And I think, well, these are some of her outdoor windrows too.
These are others. These are yours.
Okay, I'm gonna let Jean go, and then I'll probably interrupt her once in a while.
So all in all, we really wanted to make sure that we were composting indoors as much as possible. That is the rule. Always compost indoors. We don't want to liberate the virus. The virus can be spread on the air. It bioaerosolizes and leaves the house. So it goes out through fans. Fans are always on in those houses. And it's hot enough that they can't allow us to work in there without the fans on. So depending on the time of year. But at this time, and this was April, it still was too hot. They really needed to have the fans on. There's another, I won't go into that right now. So these are just outdoor windrows. This is how some of them, like with Mary's situation, where they might not have had enough indoor space to do the composting. We've got to move them out. And we want to move these birds and the eggs and the feed and all that kind of stuff as little as possible. And I say, this is actually not part of our jobs. So Mary and I didn't do this as our jobs because we don't have funding to do this right now. So if we had funding that would have allowed us to respond to an emergency like this, we could have. We were brought in by APHIS directly. So we were APHIS employees for the time period.
We took vacation, don't worry.
Yeah. So carbon sources are tremendously important. We have to make sure that they bring carbon sources on it. And right now we're writing all of the stuff that needed to be written we have a very large network of people from California to Virginia. And a lot of them are at land-grant universities, and we all sort of work on this together and have meetings every couple years to talk about mortality. It's a fun time had by all. Anyway, shavings, we can use shavings, and they're oftentimes on farms, and they're used as bedding already for the animals. But they don't give you the porosity that you really want. You really want chunkier material underneath. The chunkier, the better, because you need the air to be pulled under the pile from the bottom, and the heat pulls up through chimney effect. But we really like chunkier material, but we've got to work with what's on hand. And as you can see here, this was South Dakota. There's nothing out there. There were no trees out there. It was just really hard to find any carbon. However, so they had the shavings. They had some shavings they brought in. This gray stuff up here is sunflower hulls. So the sunflower hulls actually held their strength, and we had good porosity around those. So we could use those as the base, and the air would be able to be pulled in from the bottom of the pile so that we'd have fresh air going through those piles. None of these piles are turned in the beginning. They're all static piles. So we want them to work by themselves. We don't want them, and if we build them right, they will. There's really no problem. We've been doing it for a very long time. So this gray stuff up here is, then this up here is a hot pile of manure. That's me on top of it. I did walk up on top of it. So it's a pretty good sized pile of manure. It was 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So we had good heat in that. So we could use that if we needed to for cover material and for other stuff, because it would cook the birds and they would degrade in somewhere around 15, 16 days. All different ages, so you can see they get really messy. They have bad hair days when they are starting to go down. You can see over here, these guys, their feathers are sticking up, and I only worked with turkeys. Mary only worked with chickens as it happened, but there was no rhyme or reason to that. So all different ages. We did bring the littlest, so the babies, we brought in with the adults, with some of the adults, because they needed to get access to that barn right away, and APHIS allowed them to move them from one barn to another barn.
Plus it would have been harder to compost smaller birds by themselves.
Yep. The barns in California, North Dakota were beautiful. They were sealed, they were contained, they were good barns, they were a lot better than what Mary had to deal with. You could play football inside if you needed to. They were really good-sized barns. In California, it was pretty ridiculous. They had curtains, so they didn't have containment really. So there were just curtains over here, or would have been curtains over there, but they were open. There was a train track right over here, and they had a dinner train that came by every once in a while. They did have to change their process because they were showing off agriculture. So they did shut the train down for a little while, and they didn't bring it by this area. But it's Modesto, so you might as well be looking at the agriculture, I guess. So just a couple of things in these photos. All we could use was bobcats, so we're using the little bobcats because the ceilings are so low, the waterers are there. We had to dump all the waterers. They had to be pulled up so that we didn't destroy them. There are misters up here as well, and I think that's it for that one. And this is a pile of feed, so what we did was we just directed all the feed right into the barn so it could all be pushed together and we could compost all of it, because all of that stuff has to be sanitized. Anything that's on the farm has to be sanitized. One of the things that we ended up having to do with this farm was these birds had died from the avian influenza. So we didn't have to use any foam in here. When we add foam to it, we're adding thousands of gallons of water to it. So we're working with two different mediums, and people had to get used to that, the fact that this is going to be different. These piles, because we didn't have any moisture in there, any extra moisture in there, were extremely dry. So what we did was we put the foggers on in those buildings and added moisture to those piles, and then the temperatures went up pretty well because they were so dry that the moisture was just too low for composting to actually occur. But this is what they should look like. They should be long piles. We shouldn't have any, maybe some feathers, but even feathers, we want everything covered. So everything has to be covered with carbon. And you have to have some kind of material. The manure could be used over top. Other things could be used other carbon sources could be used over top. But we have to have everything well covered. Back to South Dakota, what we do is we have to take that clumped manure that's underneath, the bedding and manure that's underneath the birds, because these are all on the floor. There's no cages. There's nothing happening there. So we could just take the loader and go down the middle row and clear that out. Then we put carbon on top of that because we have to have that air flowing from the bottom. So put the carbon on top, and then we took birds from the sides and loaded those back on. There was controversy over whether we should be making a mixed center, more like a Twinkie. So we would have the carbon down, then we should mix them, and then we would put the carbon over top. So there's still controversy over that. We prefer the layered method because we're moving the birds less. We're not creating a bioaerosol there when we're working with them, because we already have to move them, so they're already mixing with carbon, they're already mixing with the clumped manure that's underneath them. So 60,000 turkeys here, and that's what we really should be looking like. It should look like toward the end. I have another picture that I'll show you. There's a little bit of material on the floor, but the floor should be pretty clean, even though they're dirt floors. Most of the buildings that I was in had dirt floors. But it should be a nice long windrow, and they were, like I said, we could play football in those buildings. This is a clean floor, so there was one guy that was on the loader, and he just would go sailing around all the poles and get it all from around the poles. He didn't have to do it manually. He was actually able to pick it up. And then after that, a cleaning company would come in and disinfect. So when this barn was ready to be disinfected at this point. But that's because we moved the baby birds out of this one and into a different one. Temperatures. We didn't have any rules for releasing the piles. So when are we finished? When have we disinfected? And I always thought in my head, well, we'd be testing X amount of days in. 6 days, we'd be testing those piles to make sure that we didn't have any virus left in the piles. That's not what was happening. That's not what the government was paying for. So what they were doing was, and we do this also, we regulate by process. In New York State, we regulate a lot by process. So the only rules that we have for composting, one of the few rules that we have for composting is the EPA 503s, and that's for biosolids. It's for human manure. So we used those because we knew that we could count on that because it had been tested. And also, Virginia's had a lot of low-path AI that they've done some work with, but some of their piles have sat for 7 years because the farmers don't have the confidence to say, oh yeah, I'm going to spread that on my farm. And so there's a lot of that. What do we do? Composting should be indoors as much as possible and outdoors with as little movement as possible. Should we leave the fans on? I thought we should cut a big filter and put it up on the fan so that we weren't releasing, so that everything was filtered. before it went out of the barns, but that never got any traction, so we've just aerated the barns, and we spread the disease. I mean, as as you can imagine, 50 million birds, it was spreading. And in some places in Minnesota, where Mary was, in Iowa, we had massive spread in those states. In North Dakota, we only had 2 incidents. California, we had the 1. Some other states, we did have problems with disease transfer. So, we had a new outbreak this year. So we have an outbreak in Indiana right now. And we talk about it being right now because it is existing. All of the birds are in piles, but it's only 1 incident. It seems like everything was contained. There was a high path farm, and then it was surrounded by a couple of low path farms. So they've got that contained, and we haven't had any more outbreaks at this point. But we were going into this in the winter, and I said, we have this phone call every Wednesday to talk about this stuff. As you can see, we have kind of an exciting life. We talk about dead stuff a lot. Anyway, we had to deal with cold weather, freezing birds, frozen birds, and all that kind of stuff. And it's different to be composting, to start composting at those times of year. So making sure that the windrows were taller, bigger, that we weren't putting frozen birds in, that we had good chunky material in there. If we have to put frozen birds in the pile, then we want to probably add some of that hot manure that was out on that was composted. And one of the lessons learned here is that the farmers really have to be composting. They really have to be composting their manure and their routine mortality, they call it, the routine mortality, so that they have practice, number one, and they understand what materials work and what materials don't work. And if they had the hot compost, the hot manure compost on farm, then they can use that in a cold situation. We also can use other things, leaf and yard waste compost, wood chips, other things are hot in the winter, and we can bring those things in. Birds can be incorporated into piles frozen, but they're not going to start heating up until the outside temperature, the air temperature, heats up. So until it warms up, that's not going to happen. One time we put roadkill into a pile, and it was March, and it was 5 degrees out that day, and the pile just froze. They were frozen deer, and it just went down. And this is in a different situation. The pile started warming up in May. So, we used to keep ice in carbon to keep it cold, keep ice. Partially frozen piles can heat up, so if they've already started one or they have some heat in the pile, it will ripple down the pile. So we've done that before, and that works pretty well. So a lot of times we're doing these in what we call the lasagna method, layers. And we'll do them, if we don't have all the birds at one time, we'll build the pile here, that's hot. Then we're adding some other birds, adding others in the winter, through the winter, or cows or whatever, and we're adding those through winter. And it heats up. Compost covers could be used, and they asked us that early on. We're considered experts, so they ask us a lot of these questions. Sometimes they listen to us, and sometimes they don't. We've had that experience. But, at first I'm thinking that's just another waste product. We really don't want to do that. So we also can use those if we have to insulate, to keep moisture in and out. But we also can do that with a biofilter of carbon. So we can put wood chips over top of any of these and accomplish the same thing. So we prefer to do that way, and in New York we tend to, regulation-wise, we tend to do that when we have a problem. When managing the frozen piles, the clock starts when it gets to 110 or 36 C. So, you can say, okay, we need this much more time, but that doesn't work. I'm going to talk, okay. I'm going to talk about that. Oh, that slide must have gotten out.
Well, you had the EPA release, but you didn't do
I had a slide there. It must have dropped out. Anyway, so what do we do after we've built these piles? We're taking temperatures, or somebody's taking temperatures. Usually the APHIS vets or somebody on site will be taking temperatures after we leave. We're there to build the piles to make sure they are working. Then somebody monitors, because there's no sense in us being there through that time period. In 14 days, and this was being debated as we were building piles, in 14 days we decided that the pile could be turned once. And at that point, if we've met the temperatures, if we've gotten, at that point we were looking at 133 to 150, if we had gotten that for 10 days, then 10 days in that time period, in that pile, then we could turn that pile. What we do, or 3 days, I'm sorry, 3 days. Then at 14 days, we could turn that pile. And what we would do is, at that point, we would turn the pile outside. Because if we've gotten those temperatures, then we've killed the virus, and then that could be moved. So we'd move that outdoors to finish composting. But at that point, it was sanitized, and that's what we were trying to accomplish at that point. Then they can go in and take care of those buildings and disinfect the buildings. So just in general, understand where the farm and farmer are coming from. Take weather into account. Assess which are the best methods to dispose of the residuals. All the materials, the dead stock, the feed, the eggs, water, all that kind of stuff. Develop guidance that's flexible, because every situation's different, and every carbon source is going to be different, and so we've got to be able to be flexible enough to be able to accommodate and get the job done. Are we more prepared than before the outbreak? Yeah, we're definitely more prepared. So that's it. Yes, and then we've discussed it when you don't reach your temperatures, because there are about 12 of us that are out. There were 12 of us that from different parts of the country, and 2 of those were Canadians. So they were bringing them down to do some of this.
Can I address that?
Yeah.
So basically, the rule that we were going by was actually an EPA 503 rule for biosolids, which basically says, in a static system, 3 days at 131, actually it says 3 consecutive days.
And it's not static.
At 131.
It's not per static.
Or, the static is longer, you're right.
Yes.
Okay, so in a turn window, 3 days at 131.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, or higher, okay, says that it is basically safe to use in any situation. Okay, that's why we get Milwaukee's manure in our loads, if we want to put it on our garden.
Milorganite.
Yeah. But that's the only rule there ever was. So people just sort of use it as a guidepost now. But if you look at all of the literature on what is inactivating the AI virus, it's 130 will kill it in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay? And then lower temperatures will take a little bit longer, but even at 35, we're much, so even at even at 35 degrees Fahrenheit, it will die, it will inactivate within like a week and a half. The AI virus is very not stable. It's like E. coli. It's like, all those. So we were trying.
However, it can persist in the fields, in a pond or whatever, for a long period of time.
Right,
months.
in the water. It can. That's a whole different. Different.
Yep.
But in a contained situation, and that's why you can carry it on your shoes. Really, is probably more how it's spread than
shoes and
tires,
rather
than the aerosols. Because if in the chicken barn, 5 next to each other, only 2 barns died, that air had to have been going in between, and those other 3 barns didn't die.
Mm-hmm.
But so what we finally got out, it was sort of a case-by-case basis, and I don't know if you ask more questions, usually the answer in composting is it depends. So, but if you took it case-by-case and looked at trends and temperatures that they were reaching, as long as they were thermophilic, so anywhere between 104 or 110 and 160, you were going to have the right situation to get rid of that, to inactivate that virus.
Yeah, and we have evidence that at 90 Fahrenheit we can inactivate the virus.
And on top of it,
So, with our research.
Sanitation of the barns themselves only needed to be like 2 days at 105.
Yep.
So why are we treating the compost so differently and making such a more stringent, basically we were more worried about the birds decomposing and there not being any flesh waste or anything like that left when we turned or when we released the compost.
Yeah. You want to do it?
Sure. So low path is always circulated in birds almost always, and it causes some distress. Maybe a couple of birds die. It causes ruffled feathers. It causes loss of egg production. But in general, you probably a chicken farmer, even one who has them in their backyard, probably has low path at most times, but doesn't necessarily notice anything. The high path is actually when you carry the virus that's carried by wild birds into a low path situation and the viruses mutate.
Right.
Okay, and then it becomes high path and it almost always immediately kills within 2 or 3 days of getting the virus, which is why we're not so sure that it actually is airborne, even though they say it is, because those other houses didn't die.
Yeah.
And if you're going in, but the rules are, it's a reportable disease, so the rules are you have to kill them all and get rid of it because you don't want to pass it.
And they look at a whole radius also. So they're looking at a radius. So farms in the area are also checked. Backyard flocks are checked
within 3 miles and 10 miles. And if you have birds of your own, you are not allowed to go out and test.
Right.
Because you don't want to bring it back to your birds.
Right.
Things like that.
Yeah.
Studies, and I think they actually in some of those situations they did put catchments out there by the fans.
Yeah.
And they were within I think it was 3 feet of the houses they found the virus, but beyond that they didn't.
Right. And what they may do is they may just put a, so to speak, a condom on the fan and bring it down to the ground. So it would just take everything to the ground and put it through a biofilter, and then you deal with it there instead of going further out. So it's either that or some kind of filtration. Wild birds. It's wild birds. Well, it could have more to do with that. Who knows? I don't think we know that.
Possibly, the longer that the wild
Certainly
birds
could
stay,
be.
they carry it. That's possible.
Yeah, but this definitely spread through the migration routes, and luckily didn't hit the eastern
And you could see where
flyway.
Each time in the flyway, that's where the when the birds were flying over, that's when it hit.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.